On a humid evening in late July 1932, three black sedans rolled slowly through the streets of Harlem, their engines rumbling low beneath the sound of jazz spilling from basement clubs and the chatter of men gathered on stoops. The automobiles carried 8 men dressed in dark suits, fedoras pulled low over their eyes, each one armed with revolvers and Thompson submachine guns hidden beneath long coats, despite the summer heat. They had been sent north from the Italian neighborhoods of Lower Manhattan with clear instructions from Charles "Lucky" Luciano, at that time one of the most powerful organized crime figures in New York City. Their target was not a single individual, but an entire operation. The numbers racket controlled by African-American operators in Harlem. A daily lottery system that had become the economic backbone of the neighborhood during the Depression years when legitimate employment remained scarce and discriminatory. The numbers game functioned simply. Residents placed small bets, often just pennies or nickels, on 3-digit combinations. Winners received payouts at odds of 600 to 1, though the actual mathematical odds stood at 1,000 to 1. The difference represented profit for the operators, collectors, and bankers who ran the system. What made the Harlem numbers operation significant was not merely its profitability, but its structure. Unlike the white-controlled gambling operations in other parts of the city, the Harlem numbers game remained almost entirely in the hands of African-American entrepreneurs who employed hundreds of runners, collectors, and clerks from the community. The money stayed in Harlem. It funded small businesses, paid rent for struggling families, and provided capital that banks refused to extend to black borrowers. Luciano and his associates viewed this independent economic system as both an opportunity and an affront. In their understanding of organized crime's territorial logic, all gambling in New York should flow through their organizational structure, with appropriate tribute paid upward. The fact that Harlem's numbers operators ran their business without seeking permission or offering tribute represented a gap in their control, an anomaly that suggested weakness. For months, Luciano's intermediaries had approached various Harlem numbers, bankers, with offers that were framed as partnerships but understood as demands. The Italians would provide protection, they said, in exchange for a substantial percentage of the profits. The implication was clear: protection primarily from the Italians themselves. The Harlem operators had declined these offers. Their refusal was not based on bravado, but on economic calculation and community obligation. Accepting Luciano's terms would have meant surrendering control of one of the few significant economic enterprises in Harlem to outside interests. It would have meant laying off African-American employees to make room for Italian overseers. It would have meant extracting wealth from one of the poorest communities in New York to enrich men who already controlled vast criminal enterprises across the city. The numbers bankers understood that their businesses represented more than personal profit. They represented proof that black entrepreneurship could succeed, that community-based economic systems could function, that Harlem did not need to remain perpetually dependent on the scraps white-controlled businesses chose to offer. The rejection of Luciano's overtures had been conveyed politely but firmly through intermediaries. No direct confrontation occurred. No public statements were made. The Harlem operators simply continued running their businesses as they had before, as if the Italian mob's demands had never been made. This quiet refusal, this absence of acknowledgement of Luciano's authority, represented a form of disrespect more profound than any verbal insult could have conveyed. In the logic of organized crime, where power rested on the perception of unchallengeable authority, the refusal to even negotiate was intolerable. The 8 men in the 3 sedans had been sent to correct this intolerable situation. Their instructions, according to later testimony from law enforcement sources and participants who survived the broader conflict, were to enter the offices and apartments where the numbers bankers conducted business, to destroy the physical infrastructure of the operation, and to kill anyone who resisted. The expectation was that a sudden, overwhelming display of force would shatter the Harlem operators' resistance. Faced with bodies and burned ledgers, the survivors would accept whatever terms were offered. This had been the pattern in other neighborhoods where Luciano's organization had extended its control. The three cars stopped on 135th Street near the corner of 7th Avenue, an intersection that served as one of the operational centers of the Harlem numbers racket. The men exited the vehicles, checking their weapons one final time before moving toward the entrance of a 4-story brownstone building. Inside this building, according to their intelligence, they would find Stephanie St. Clair, a woman who had become one of the most successful numbers operators in Harlem. Stephanie St. Clair was not a figure who fit conventional expectations. Born in Martinique in 1897, she had arrived in Harlem in 1912 with little money and no connections to established power structures. She began working in the numbers game as a runner, collecting bets from residents and delivering them to bankers. Her education, she had attended school in Martinique and spoke fluent French, set her apart from many in the business. More importantly, she possessed an exceptional memory for numbers and an analytical mind that allowed her to track complex betting patterns and maintain accurate accounts without extensive written records. By 1923, she had accumulated enough capital to become a banker herself, accepting bets directly and managing her own network of runners. What distinguished St. Clair's operation was its meticulous organization and its explicit connection to community uplift. She paid her employees well by Depression-era standards and on time. She extended credit to small business owners at rates far below what loan sharks charged. She refused to allow her runners to accept bets from people who clearly could not afford to lose, a policy that cost her money but earned her widespread respect. She also refused to pay protection money to corrupt police officers, instead documenting their demands in careful detail and filing complaints through legal channels, even when she knew those complaints would likely be ignored. By 1932, St. Clair controlled a substantial portion of Harlem's numbers operation, working in loose cooperation with other major operators like Casper Holstein and Ellsworth "Bumpy" Johnson. She had also become a public figure, writing letters to newspapers, organizing community meetings, and speaking openly about police corruption and the economic exploitation of Harlem. She referred to herself as Queenie in some contexts, and made no effort to hide her role in the numbers game, arguing that it represented a legitimate business, providing a service the community wanted and employing people who had no other options. The men sent by Luciano knew about St. Clair's reputation, but seemed to have dismissed its significance. She was a woman operating in a world they understood as belonging exclusively to men. She was black, operating in a community they viewed as disorganized and powerless. She ran a gambling operation, but she had no soldiers, no gunmen, no capacity for the kind of violence they could bring to bear. Their intelligence had failed to account for factors that would prove decisive. What happened in the following minutes remains disputed in its details. No comprehensive police report documented the incident, likely because corrupt officers chose to file no report at all. What is known comes from later testimony, newspaper accounts, and the simple, undeniable fact that all 8 men sent to attack St. Clair's operation were dead within hours. According to accounts that emerged later, the men entering the brownstone were met not by surprised numbers operators, but by prepared defenders. The Harlem numbers bankers had known about Luciano's intentions. They had known because they employed their own network of informants, including corrupt police officers who were more loyal to the African-American operators they had grown up with than to Italian mobsters who treated them with contempt. They had known because bartenders and street hustlers had heard the planning discussions in downtown Italian social clubs and passed the information north. They had known because the Italian mob's assumption that black communities were primitive intelligence deserts was profoundly wrong. St. Clair and her associates had prepared accordingly. The building where her operation was headquartered had been fortified. The stairwells had been narrowed with strategically placed furniture, creating fatal funnels. Men who knew the building's layout intimately waited in positions that gave them clear lines of fire while remaining concealed. These defenders were not professional gunmen in the manner of the Italian mob's soldiers, but they were men with military experience from the First World War, men who had fought in France and learned about fields of fire and tactical positioning, then returned home to a country that offered them nothing but segregation and unemployment. They had adapted those skills to defending the economic infrastructure their community had built. The men Luciano sent walked into a prepared ambush. The first ones through the door were killed almost immediately. The sounds of gunfire brought police, but the responding officers moved slowly, as they had been instructed to do by superiors who had been paid to allow the Italian mob to operate freely. By the time officers finally entered the building, they found bodies and weapons, but no living witnesses, except residents of the building who claimed to have seen nothing and heard nothing beyond the sound of firecrackers, which was obviously false, but which the police chose not to challenge. The remaining men from Luciano's hit squad, those who had stayed outside as backup or getaway drivers, attempted to flee. According to multiple accounts, they were pursued by men who emerged from alleys and doorways throughout the surrounding blocks. Harlem in 1932 was a densely populated neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else's business and where strangers, especially armed Italian men in expensive suits, were immediately noticeable. The white gunmen found themselves in unfamiliar territory, unable to distinguish safe streets from dead ends, unable to identify who was watching them and who was hunting them. At least 3 of the men were killed in different locations across Harlem that night. One body was found in an alley behind a speakeasy on 140th Street. Another was discovered in a vacant lot near the Harlem River. The third was pulled from the East River 3 days later, badly beaten before being shot. The exact fate of the remaining men from the hit squad has never been definitively established. They simply disappeared. No bodies were recovered. No one claimed to have seen them after that night. In later years, several Harlem residents privately claimed that those men had been buried in locations that would never be searched, or that their bodies had been disposed of in ways that left no evidence. What is certain is that not one of the 8 men sent to Harlem returned to report to Luciano. The immediate aftermath of the failed attack did not involve celebration or public acknowledgement. Stephanie St. Clair and the other numbers operators continued running their businesses. They filed no police reports about the attack because they knew the police would use any such reports as pretexts for raids. They made no public statements claiming victory because they understood that this was merely the first engagement in what would likely become a prolonged conflict. What they did instead was prepare for the next phase. St. Clair understood that Luciano would not accept this humiliation without response. He could not allow it to become public knowledge that he had sent 8 armed men into Harlem and lost all of them. Such a loss would undermine his authority, not just in Harlem, but across all his operations. Other neighborhoods might begin to question whether they needed to pay tribute to an organization that could be defeated so decisively. Luciano's only options were to escalate with overwhelming force or to quietly negotiate a different arrangement while maintaining a public posture of control. St. Clair and her associates began building the coalition they would need for either scenario. They reached out to Bumpy Johnson, an enforcer and operator who had connections throughout Harlem's criminal networks and who commanded genuine loyalty from men willing to fight. Johnson was not a romantic figure. He was a violent man when violence was required, but he was also intelligent and understood that sustained conflict with the Italian mob would destroy Harlem's economy. The numbers game required stability to function. Bettors would not place bets if they believed the money might never be paid out. Runners would not work if they expected to be caught in crossfire. Johnson agreed to coordinate the defense of Harlem's numbers operations, bringing together the various independent operators who had previously worked in loose cooperation into something approaching a unified command structure. They also reached out to Harlem's legitimate business community, to ministers, to the few African-American lawyers who practiced in New York, and to journalists at the black newspapers that served the community. St. Clair explained the situation plainly. The Italian mob wanted to take control of the only significant black-owned business enterprise in Harlem. If they succeeded, hundreds of jobs would disappear. The money that currently circulated through the community would be extracted to downtown Manhattan. The numbers game would continue, but it would enrich outsiders rather than residents. This was not merely a criminal dispute. This was about economic self-determination. This framing proved effective because it was accurate. The ministers who preached against gambling on Sundays knew that those same numbers runners donated to church-building funds. The lawyers who argued for civil rights knew that numbers operators paid legal fees for community members who could not afford representation. The journalists who covered Harlem's cultural renaissance understood that the clubs and theaters where that renaissance occurred were often financed by numbers money. Everyone connected to Harlem's economic ecosystem had a stake in preventing an Italian takeover. St. Clair also took a more audacious step. She began documenting and publicizing police corruption in detail. She kept careful records of which officers accepted bribes, from which mob figures, how much they were paid, and what protection they provided in return. She provided this information to black newspapers, which published it, and to reform politicians, who used it in campaigns against Tammany Hall. This strategy served multiple purposes. It made it more difficult for corrupt officers to openly assist the Italian mob in Harlem without facing exposure. It aligned the numbers operators with progressive political forces that were seeking to reduce organized crime's influence in New York. And it created a public record that made it clear the Italian mob's attempt to control Harlem was being resisted not just by criminals, but by a community defending its economic independence. Luciano's response to the failed hit squad did not come immediately. Weeks passed. The Italian mob continued its operations in other parts of the city without apparent disruption. This silence was strategic. Luciano was attempting to demonstrate that the Harlem incident was insignificant, an anomaly not worth his attention. He was also assessing his options and consulting with other organized crime figures about the best approach. What Luciano came to understand, through intelligence provided by the police officers on his payroll who were willing to discuss the situation honestly, was that Harlem was not comparable to other neighborhoods where he had extended control. The Italian mob's power in areas like the Lower East Side or Brooklyn rested on ethnic solidarity and immigrant community structures that made it difficult for law enforcement to penetrate their operations. They controlled unions, legitimate businesses, and social clubs that gave them multiple sources of revenue and influence. They could offer protection, not just from outside threats, but from each other. resolving disputes within the Italian community before they escalated to violence that would bring police attention. None of these advantages applied in Harlem. The Italian mob had no ethnic ties to the African American community. They controlled no legitimate businesses in the neighborhood and had no presence in Harlem's churches, social clubs, or community organizations. They could not position themselves as community protectors because the community viewed them as outside predators. The only service they could offer was protection from themselves, and Harlem had demonstrated it did not need that protection. Moreover, a prolonged violent campaign in Harlem would be extraordinarily costly. The Italian mob would need to send repeated waves of gunmen into hostile territory, where they had no intelligence network, and where every resident potentially supported their opponents. They would need to maintain a permanent military presence, effectively occupying the neighborhood, to prevent the numbers operators from simply resuming business after each attack. This would require dedicating substantial resources to a single operation while creating risk in all their other ventures. And there was no guarantee of success. The failed hit squad had demonstrated that Harlem's defenders were competent and prepared. Luciano also faced political complications. The publicity St. Clair generated about police corruption and mob control of gambling began to create pressure from reform elements in city government. Mayor Jimmy Walker had resigned in September 1932 under pressure from corruption investigations, and there was increasing public demand for law enforcement to take organized crime seriously. A highly visible war in Harlem would make it difficult for the Italian mob's political protectors to continue providing cover. The police might be forced to actually enforce laws, at least temporarily, which would disrupt operations across the city. By late autumn of 1932, intermediaries began approaching the Harlem numbers operators with new proposals. These proposals no longer demanded control of the operations or tribute payments. Instead, they suggested cooperation in limited areas. Perhaps the Italian mob could handle certain aspects of money laundering or provide access to corrupt judges who could fix cases if operators were arrested. The terms being discussed represented negotiation between equals rather than demands from a superior to an inferior. St. Clair and her associates carefully considered these overtures. They understood that some form of accommodation with the Italian mob might be necessary for long-term stability. They also understood that they were negotiating from a position of strength that might not last. The coalition they had built in Harlem was held together by immediate threat. If that threat receded, the various operators might return to competing with each other rather than maintaining unified resistance. Additionally, there were always individuals within any community who would be willing to accept outside control in exchange for personal advantage. The final arrangement that emerged from these negotiations was never formally documented, but its contours became clear through the behavior of both parties in subsequent years. The Harlem numbers operators maintained independent control of their businesses. They did not pay tribute to the Italian mob. However, they agreed not to expand their operations beyond Harlem into other neighborhoods where the Italian mob had established presence. They also agreed to avoid business practices that would draw unwanted law enforcement attention that might spill over into affecting Italian operations elsewhere in the city. In exchange, the Italian mob withdrew its claim to control Harlem's gambling operations. Luciano's organization would not send more hit squads or attempt further violent takeovers. They would use their political connections to provide some degree of protection from law enforcement crackdowns. Though this protection was limited and inconsistent, importantly, this arrangement was understood by both sides as negotiated peace rather than submission. The immediate practical effect of this arrangement was stability. The numbers game continued to function in Harlem throughout the remainder of the 1930s, providing employment and circulating money through the community during the Depression's worst years. St. Clair and other operators continued to profit substantially, and they used those profits in ways that strengthened Harlem's economic infrastructure. They provided capital for businesses that could not obtain bank loans. They funded community organizations. They employed hundreds of residents who had no other income options. The broader significance of what occurred in 1932 extended beyond the immediate preservation of Harlem's numbers operations. The successful resistance to the Italian mob's takeover attempt demonstrated that African American communities could organize effective collective action in defense of their economic interests. This was not a trivial demonstration. The dominant narrative of the period held that black communities were disorganized, that they lacked the discipline and strategic thinking necessary for sustained resistance to more powerful groups, that they were ultimately dependent on white-controlled institutions for whatever limited prosperity they might achieve. The events in Harlem contradicted that narrative. The defense against Luciano's hit squad was not spontaneous or emotional. It was planned, coordinated, and executed by people who understood tactics and intelligence and who built the organizational structures necessary to prevail. The subsequent negotiation was conducted shrewdly, with careful attention to long-term community interests rather than short-term personal gain. This success provided a template that would be referenced in later years when African American communities confronted other forms of economic exploitation and organized crime infiltration. The arrangement also affected Luciano's position within organized crime hierarchies. While he maintained his status as a powerful figure, the failed Harlem operation became known within criminal circles, even though it was never publicized broadly. Other operators understood that there were limits to where the Italian mob could extend control through force alone. This understanding contributed to the development of more negotiated arrangements in other ethnically distinct neighborhoods, where organized crime figures recognized that cooperation with existing local operators might be more profitable and less costly than attempted conquest. For St. Clair specifically, the successful resistance enhanced her reputation and influence. She continued operating the numbers game until her retirement in the early 1940s, after which she devoted much of her time to community activism and continued publicizing police corruption. Her willingness to fight rather than submit, and her success in that fight, made her a symbol of resistance that extended beyond criminal enterprise. When civil rights activists in later decades looked for historical examples of black economic self-determination and successful resistance to exploitation, the story of Harlem's numbers operators defending their businesses became one of the examples they cited. The longer-term consequences were more complex. The arrangement that preserved Harlem's control over the numbers game in the 1930s did not survive unchanged into the post-World War II period. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, increased law enforcement pressure, the emergence of new organized crime figures, and changes in Harlem's demographic and economic conditions had eroded the position of the original operators. The numbers game itself began to decline in profitability as legal forms of gambling expanded and as the community became poorer and less able to sustain regular betting. However, the principle established in 1932 that African American communities could organize effective resistance to outside economic control persisted and influenced subsequent organizing efforts. When civil rights organizations fought against employment discrimination, when community groups resisted urban renewal programs that destroyed black neighborhoods, when economic development activists pushed for community control of businesses and services, they were building on foundations that had been laid in part by the numbers operators who refused to surrender to Lucky Luciano. The story also illustrates the complicated relationship between illegal enterprise and community development in contexts where legal economic opportunities are systematically denied. The numbers game was illegal gambling, and the operators profited from it personally. Yet, in the specific context of Depression-era Harlem, where banks would not lend to black entrepreneurs and where employment discrimination was pervasive and legal, the numbers game functioned as a form of community banking and economic development that would not otherwise have existed. St. Clair and other operators were not altruists. They were business people pursuing profit, but the structure of their businesses meant that pursuing profit also meant employing community members and circulating money through local economic networks. This is not to romanticize illegal enterprise or to suggest that organized crime serves beneficial community functions. Rather, it is to recognize that in situations where legal economic systems are structured to exclude entire populations, those populations will create alternative economic systems, and those alternative systems will reflect both the entrepreneurial capabilities and the structural constraints of the people who create them. The numbers game in Harlem was simultaneously exploitation, taking money from people who could not afford to lose it through what was essentially a mathematically rigged lottery, and opportunity, providing employment and access to capital that the legal economy denied. The physical confrontation that occurred in July 1932 was brief and violent, but it was also almost incidental to the larger significance of the event. The real story was not about 8 men dying in Harlem, but about a community successfully defending its economic autonomy against a vastly more powerful external threat. That defense required preparation, intelligence, tactical skill, political maneuvering, coalition building, and strategic communication. It required understanding not just how to win a single violent confrontation, but how to create conditions where the opposing party would conclude that negotiation served their interests better than continued conflict. St. Clair and her associates achieved this not through superior firepower, but through superior understanding of their own advantages and their opponent's weaknesses. They recognized that the Italian mob's power rested primarily on reputation and on the assumption that resistance would be futile. By demonstrating that resistance was not only possible but could succeed, they destroyed that assumption. They also recognized that Luciano needed to preserve his reputation and could not afford to be seen as having backed down under pressure. The negotiated arrangement allowed him to reframe the outcome as strategic choice rather than defeat, which made it possible for him to accept terms that left Harlem's numbers operators in control. This kind of strategic thinking, understanding an opponent's needs and constraints as clearly as one's own, creating face-saving ways for them to accept outcomes they did not originally want. Building coalitions that increased one's relative power without requiring direct confrontation would become central to civil rights organizing in subsequent decades. The techniques that St. Clair and other Harlem numbers operators used to defend their businesses were not fundamentally different from the techniques that later activists used to challenge segregation and discrimination. Both required careful planning. Both required building coalitions across different community segments. Both required understanding that power responds to pressure rather than to moral argument alone. And both required patience and willingness to accept partial victories as steps toward larger goals. The memory of the failed hit squad was preserved in Harlem through oral tradition and through the carefully maintained records that Saint Clair kept throughout her life. She donated many of these records to historical archives before her death in 1969, ensuring that the documentation of police corruption and organized crime's attempted control of Harlem would be available to future researchers. Those records have been used by historians studying both organized crime and African American economic history, providing evidence for arguments about community resistance and economic self-determination. In the immediate years following 1932, Harlem's numbers operators continued to face challenges from law enforcement, from internal competition, and from ongoing pressure by organized crime figures seeking to establish footholds in the community. The arrangement negotiated with Luciano did not eliminate all conflict. However, it established a precedent that Harlem's economic enterprises would not be taken over without resistance, and that resistance could be effective. This precedent made subsequent attempted takeovers more difficult and more costly for outside groups to pursue. The broader criminal landscape of New York changed substantially during the 1930s as law enforcement tactics evolved and as internal conflicts within organized crime organizations reshaped territorial arrangements. Luciano himself was prosecuted and imprisoned in 1936 on charges of compulsory prostitution, effectively ending his direct control of criminal operations, though he maintained influence from prison. The Italian mob's structure became more decentralized, and different crime families negotiated their own arrangements with various community operators throughout the city. Throughout these changes, Harlem's numbers game maintained substantially more local control than comparable operations in other neighborhoods. This was not solely because of the successful resistance in 1932, but that resistance was a significant factor. It demonstrated that attempts at forced takeover would be costly and potentially unsuccessful, which discouraged such attempts and encouraged negotiation instead. This dynamic preserved employment and capital circulation within Harlem that would likely have been extracted if outside control had been established. The legacy of these events extended into the post-World War II civil rights movement in ways that were not always directly acknowledged, but were nonetheless real. Veterans of the numbers game and their families were often involved in civil rights organizing. They brought organizational skills, understanding of power dynamics, and willingness to resist authority that had been developed through their economic activities. The same networks that had been used to coordinate the numbers game, networks of trust, communication, and mutual obligation that crossed class and neighborhood boundaries within Harlem, were repurposed for civil rights organizing. St. Clair herself remained a public figure in Harlem for decades after her retirement from the numbers game. She continued to write letters to newspapers, to document police corruption, and to speak at community meetings about economic exploitation and the need for black economic independence. Her reputation was complicated. She was admired by many for her resistance to outside control and her contributions to the community. Criticized by others for profiting from gambling, and largely ignored by white-dominated media that found the story of a successful black female criminal entrepreneur too complicated to fit easily into prevailing narratives. When she died in 1969, her obituary in the Amsterdam News described her as a legendary figure in Harlem history who fought for her community. This characterization was accurate as far as it went, though it simplified a more complex reality. St. Clair fought for her community because doing so was also fighting for her business interests, which is not to diminish the significance of the fight, but to recognize that personal interest and community benefit can align in ways that produce real positive outcomes even when the motivation is not purely altruistic. The question of what happened to the 8 men Luciano sent to Harlem remained officially unresolved. No murders were reported to police that night, no missing persons reports were filed by their families, likely because their families understood that reporting the disappearance of men sent on a criminal mission would bring unwanted law enforcement attention. The story circulated in criminal circles and in Harlem, but was never thoroughly investigated by authorities who had no incentive to document a confrontation between two groups of criminals, particularly when that documentation might reveal the extent of police corruption and organized crime's reach. In later years, several individuals who had been present in Harlem that night provided accounts to historians and journalists. Though these accounts often conflicted in details while agreeing on the essential facts, armed men came to Harlem intending to take over the numbers operations by force. They were met with prepared resistance, and none of them survived. The exact location of bodies, the specific individuals who participated in the resistance, and the tactical details of what occurred remained subjects of speculation and conflicting testimony. What was not subject to dispute was the outcome. The Harlem numbers operations remained under local control. Luciano's organization did not gain control of Harlem's gambling. The attempted takeover failed completely, and at significant cost to those who attempted it. This outcome shaped subsequent interactions between organized crime groups and African American communities throughout New York, and influenced how such interactions proceeded in other cities where similar dynamics existed. The events of 1932 were not the only instance of African American communities successfully resisting organized crime takeover attempts, but they were among the most dramatic and consequential. They demonstrated principles that would be applied in other contexts, that detailed intelligence about opponents' plans could offset advantages in resources and firepower, that prepared defensive positions could defeat attackers even when outnumbered, that publicity and political pressure could constrain opponents' options, that negotiated settlements preserving community control were achievable when the cost of continued conflict became too high for all parties. These were practical lessons in power dynamics and community organizing that extended far beyond the specific context of illegal gambling. They were lessons about how marginalized communities could protect their interests and maintain autonomy even when confronting more powerful external forces. The fact that these lessons were learned and applied in the context of criminal enterprise rather than purely legal activity does not diminish their significance or their applicability to other forms of resistance and community organizing. The story of what happened when Luciano sent his hit squad to Harlem became part of the community's collective memory and oral tradition. It was told and retold, embellished in some versions, simplified in others, but consistently emphasizing the core message that Harlem had defended itself successfully, that external forces could not simply take what they wanted through intimidation and violence, that the community possessed the capability to organize effective resistance. This story joined other narratives of resistance and achievement that sustained Harlem through subsequent decades of economic decline, urban decay, and continued racial discrimination. The physical landscape where these events occurred changed substantially over subsequent decades. Buildings were demolished and rebuilt, businesses closed and were replaced by others. The people who witnessed the events of July 1932 died, and direct memory was replaced by transmitted memory and historical record. But the significance of what occurred persisted in the community's understanding of its own history and its capacity for organized resistance to exploitation. By the early 21st century, when historians and journalists began seriously investigating Harlem's numbers game and the confrontation with Luciano's organization, they found a story that complicated simplistic narratives about both organized crime and African American history. The numbers operators were neither purely criminal predators exploiting their own community nor purely altruistic community defenders. They were entrepreneurs operating in an illegal industry who nonetheless contributed substantially to their community's economic survival and who defended that contribution against external takeover. The Italian mob was neither all-powerful nor easily deterred. Luciano's organization controlled vast criminal enterprises and had access to corrupted law enforcement and political power. Yet they could not simply impose their will on a determined community that had prepared effective resistance. Power, even criminal power backed by violence and political corruption, had limits that could be discovered and exploited by those who understood both their own strengths and their opponents' weaknesses. The story resists simple moral categorization. It involves criminals on all sides. It involves violence that killed at least 8 men and potentially more. It involves an illegal industry that took money from poor people who could ill afford to lose it. Yet it also involves successful community resistance to economic exploitation, preservation of African American economic autonomy during a period when such autonomy was rare and precious, and demonstration of organizational capacity that contradicted prevailing racist assumptions about black communities' capabilities. What remains unambiguous is the outcome and its significance. When Lucky Luciano, one of the most powerful organized crime figures in American history, attempted to forcibly take control of Harlem's numbers operations, his attempt failed completely. The 8 men he sent to accomplish this takeover died. Harlem's numbers operators maintained control of their businesses. The community's economic infrastructure remained largely in local hands. This outcome was not accidental or fortunate. It resulted from careful preparation, intelligent strategy, effective coalition building, and willingness to fight when fighting was necessary, while also being willing to negotiate when negotiation could achieve stable peace. These are the elements of successful resistance to exploitation regardless of context: understanding when to fight and when to negotiate, building coalitions that increase relative power, using intelligence to offset resource disadvantages, creating political and social pressure that constrains opponents' options, and maintaining focus on strategic objectives rather than emotional reactions. The numbers operators of Harlem demonstrated mastery of these elements, and their success provided both practical example and inspiration for subsequent generations who faced different forms of exploitation and discrimination, but who could learn from the strategic principles their predecessors had applied. The confrontation between Luciano's organization and Harlem's numbers operators was brief in duration, but lasting in consequence. It was one moment in the long struggle for African American economic independence and self-determination, a struggle that continues in different forms. It was also one moment in the complex history of organized crime in America, demonstrating that criminal organizations' power, however great, was not unlimited and could be successfully resisted by communities willing to organize and fight for their interests. The men who died that night in Harlem were not soldiers in any conventional sense. They were criminals sent to terrorize and kill in pursuit of economic control. Their deaths were not mourned beyond their immediate circles, and official records hardly acknowledged their passing. But their failure to return, and the reasons for that failure, shaped events and influenced outcomes in ways that extended far beyond that single night. They demonstrated through their defeat what many had believed impossible: that the Italian mob's expansion could be stopped, that African American communities could organize effective military resistance, that economic autonomy could be defended successfully even against powerful external threats. This knowledge, this proof of possibility, became part of Harlem's heritage. It joined the music and literature and political organizing that made Harlem significant in African American history. It provided evidence that resistance could succeed, that power could be challenged, that communities could defend what they had built. In the decades that followed, when civil rights activists needed examples of successful black resistance to exploitation, when community organizers needed to demonstrate that coordinated action could achieve results, when historians needed to document African American agency and capability, they could point to what happened when Harlem refused to bow.